Okay, it's good. So you know by now, I'm sure those of you who've been here for Unit 1, that all serious evolutionary biologists have big beards. You remember that from last Friday. I'm not a serious biologist because I don't have a beard, but we had Sir Gillian Prance, fresh from the Amazon jungles, or the Amazon River at least, last Friday. And we're very grateful to another long-distance runner in the evolutionary biology field, Professor Sam Berry, for coming to speak to us today. He's Emeritus Professor of Genetics at University College London, and in fact I hope you have his biography there handy. I won't perhaps read it all out, but he was a former president of the Linnean Society, the British Ecological Society, the European Ecological Federation, and a lot of other things as well. So he's been very, very involved in the world of natural history, both in this country and beyond. You may not know also that he's been quite involved in some of the bioethical issues surrounding novel reproductive technologies. He was a member, for example, of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority from 1990 to 1996, and also has been very much involved in environmental affairs. He was a member of the Natural Environment Research Council for many years, and so on. Along with all these activities in the scientific and indeed advising the government sort of world, Professor Berry has been very involved in the science and religion debate for many, many years, and so comes to us with a wealth of experience in this particular area. And we've therefore, for that very reason, given him an extremely tough subject, and he's given his own particular title to this, and we also have the longest handout, I think, of any speaker so far, so we've definitely broken the record on that one as well. So Sam's going to speak to us on God, indolent, incompetent, impotent, interfering, or what? Thank you, Professor Berry. Thanks.
Having arrived in the middle of the morning, I come very much with an inferiority complex. During my time as an undergraduate at this university, did a course on the philosophy of science, which left me absolutely cold. I couldn't understand head and a tail of it. The only reason I got to the end of the course was that Jonathan Miller, who was a name that some of you may know, who was at that time a medical student, is now an international opera producer, often on television. He was also doing the same course. He used to come to all lectures 10 minutes late, park his bicycle halfway down the lecture theatre, and then rib the lecturer. So it was worth being there to hear Jonathan Miller taking the lecturer to pieces. And that's not quite the beginning and end of my philosophy, but it was certainly very near the end of it. I'm conscious that we're nearing the end of a very heavy fortnight for lots of you. I would have loved to have been here for some of the earlier talks, which means that I don't know how much what I shall say is repetition or even contradiction to what has gone on earlier. So rather than being fashionable and producing a PowerPoint, I thought what I would do is to produce what is almost a reading text. So those of you who don't want to listen, don't bother, because you've more or less got the text. I put most of the quotations in a different font so that you can easily pick up the quotations from the text. I was fascinated earlier with Arnold Lewis's talk about tapestries. I did my degree under R.A. Fisher, Sir Ronald Fisher, who more or less invented population genetics and invented a whole lot of statistics. He was a mathematician by background. He was professor of genetics in this university. And he was the sort of person, he was very short-sighted, so he never used to write down the working out of his sums. He did the crossword, but only filled in the letters where the words crossed. So people didn't know his working, and would get very cross when he would produce a result. But as it was proved time and time again, he tended to be right. But it was a completely different approach to those of us who were brought up in the natural experimental sciences. Somehow there's got to be a coalescence of the different approaches. I mean, if there is a reality out there, if there's truth out there, which certainly as a naturalist in the old-fashioned sense, I believe, in fact, following Karl Popper, that science is knowledge without a knower. And the scientist, in Kepler's word, of course, is thinking God's word who invented the science in the first place. I'm certainly not going along with Thomas Kuhn that science is really a reflection of the culture that we're living in. Now, a key element of the way that science develops is cohesion or congruence between different parts of the sciences. I did some work with Bernard Kettlewell, who was the man who worked out the natural selection on the pepper moth, the thing that comes in all the elementary textbooks about the power of natural selection. And those of you who are aware of the parascience literature will know that all sorts of mud pies have been slung at this work because of poor design of experiment, poor interpretation, and so on. But the work is, and I can testify to this from my own experience, yes. I can testify that Kettlewell's work was fine. The trouble was, and again this comes up to the tapestry end of things, he was a medical doctor. So he approached things by diagnosing what the answer was, and then somehow the evidence had to fit. And actually writing papers with him was absolutely frustrating, because one knew the two had to fit together, and they did fit together. But it didn't come out in some of his work. And as I say, he's been very much criticised in recent years, and his work has been poo-pooed by many people, and perhaps natural selection doesn't work as a result of this. That's the argument. Dobzhansky said that nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. And he's been pilloried for this enormously, the arrogance of the scientists. Interestingly, if you follow up why he said this, it was in the response to a request by a Saudi sheikh to the King Faisal of Saudi Arabia to ask the king to suppress a heresy which was spreading everywhere. And this was the request of the king. The Holy Quran, the Prophet's teachings, the majority of Islamic scientists, that's in those days, not these days, the majority of Islamic scientists, the actual facts all prove that the sun is running in its orbit. The earth is fixed and stable, spread out by God for his mankind. Anybody who professed otherwise would utter a charge of falsehood towards the Prophet, towards God, the Quran, and the Prophet. Dobzhansky's point was that this was regarding the Copernican ideas as merely a theory. And although he said it was technically correct that it was a theory, what he did go on to say is that the Quran and the Bible do not contradict Copernicus, nor does Copernicus contradict them. It is ludicrous to mistake the Bible and the Quran for primers of natural science. he went on, Dobzhansky went on, the good sheikh is probably ignorant of the evidence, but he and his like refuse to accept the radiometric evidence for the age of the earth. What's the alternative? Did the Creator see fit to play deceitful tricks on geologists and biologists? Now, it was not only the Saudi sheikh who was concerned about the earth moving, or said to be moving, so did John Calvin. I lectured some years ago in the Seminary of the Orthodox of the Americas in Boston. I was a bit worried because I'm not very learned in the fathers of the church, and I was quoting Calvin. I was assured afterwards by some of these Orthodox monks that Calvin, of course, was a father of the church. I was delighted to hear it. And Calvin said that rebuke those people who are so deranged, not only in religion, but who in all things reveal their monstrous nature, that they will say that the sun does not move, it is the earth which shifts. Now we think that's stupid. That's the sort of thing we have to take on board to bring together the appearance of things. And Dobzhansky's conclusion of his argument was that in the light of evolution, biology is perhaps intellectually the most satisfying and inspiring science. Without that light, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but asking no meaningful picture as a whole. Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, who is just retired as keeper of entomology in Harvard. He was brought up as a Southern Baptist. He was baptized and was a very keen member of his local church until he discovered evolution and was more or less drummed out. And he writes in his autobiography, science became the new light and the way. But what of religion? It cannot be dismissed as superstition. It cannot be compartmentalized as the manifestation of some separate world. From the beginning, I never could accept that science and religion are separate domains with fundamentally different questions and answer. Now, Wilson has gone on to argue that religion should be approached as an experimental, by experimental methods. And in many ways, I would agree with him. Does belief in God work? Does it make any difference to us? We certainly can't ignore the natural world. It's fascinating when you look at Paul teaching in the New Testament. Most of Paul's addresses that are recorded there are to Jews, or to Christians, or to believers, or to hangers-on. On two occasions, he's talking to non-believers in the theistics, in the religious sense. Particularly when he's talking to the people in Lystra. They were completely pagan in their beliefs. They didn't have any conventional religion. And Paul didn't preach the classical Christian things which you might expect from somebody like Paul. He didn't talk about the cross or the resurrection or the divinity of Christ. What he said to them is basically, have a look out of the window. God has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. In other words, applying to the natural world, look at that, and perhaps it will tell you something about God. Now, I put all this in a context, and I want to perhaps rather rapidly go through the context of how religious thought has developed. And I'm speaking particularly of this country, but I suspect it's not radically different in other parts of the world. And one of my texts almost is taken from the first page of The Origin of Species, in which Darwin has 3 quotations. And one of them is from Francis Bacon. Let no one, out of a weak conceit of sobriety, think that they can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's words or in the book of God's works. Rather, let all endeavour an endless proficiency in both. In other words, God wrote 2 books. He wrote a book of works, which we call the Bible, or if you're of a different persuasion, the Quran, or the holy books. But he also is the creator. He created a book of works. It's the same author, written in very different languages. But if we only read one of those books, we're only going to have part of the story. Before scientific understanding took grip, the idea of a regular law guiding the universe was unfamiliar, even to the contemporaries of Francis Bacon. The fields around towns and hamlets were filled, as soon as the day labourers had left them, by goblins and will-o'-the-wisps. And the woods, as soon as the forester had closed the door of his hut, became the haunts of fairies. The ghosts could be heard gibbering all night under the yew tree of the churchyard. The witch, a well-known figure in the village, was in the pay of lovers whose mistresses were hard to win, and of gentlemen farmers whose cattle had sickened. If a criminal was detected and punished, the astonishing event was set down as God's revenge against murder. If a dry summer threatened the harvest, the parson was expected to draw down rain by prayer. He was at work over the weekend. The charms that ward off disease, the stars of birth that rule fortune, the comet that foretold the wars in Germany, the mystic laws that govern the fall of the dice, were the common interest of ordinary men and women. In a soil that imagination had so prepared, poetry and Puritanism were likely to flourish loftily among lofty men, and basely among the base. The better kind of men were full of ardour, fancy and reverence. The ignoble were superstitious, ignorant and coarse. The world was still a mystery, of which the wonder was not dispelled in foolish minds by a daily stream of facts and cheap explanations. And then into this world comes mechanistic science, perhaps most notoriously, most importantly, Isaac Newton and the laws of motion, the physical laws. And I think the effect of this has been well described by Don Cupid. Mechanistic science was allowed to explain the structure and workings of physical nature without restriction. But who had designed this beautiful world machine and set it going in the first place? Only Scripture and Ard Lewis could answer that question. So science dealt with the everyday tick-tock of the cosmic framework. Religion dealt with the ultimates, first beginnings and last ends, God and the soul. This demarcation of scientific and theological explanations had the authority not only of Galileo — the Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go — but also of Sir Francis Bacon. It was a happy compromise while it lasted. Science actively promoted the cause of religion by showing the beautiful workmanship of the world. No mechanical theory could have originally made ducks' feet and bills to be just the shape they would need for their survival. It was a good God who had thought of putting the mountains in just the right places to precipitate rain from the clouds and give us fresh water to drink. Such is the old argument from design. And if it seems quaint to us now, it once seemed cogent and did a good job by shifting people's eyes away from seeing God at work in the freakish and fearful, to admiring his wisdom and workmanship in the ordinary course of things. Religion became less nervous and superstitious, more calm and rational. Belief in witchcraft and evil spirits, omens and portents, and little particular judgments and providences, such as praying for BMWs, gradually faded. People seemed to think that God was sending occult messages to them, or ceased to think that God was sending occult messages to them all the time. Faith became milder and cooler. But there was a fatal flaw. Religious ideas were being used to plug the gaps in scientific theory. Science could not yet explain how animals and plants had originated and had become so wonderfully adapted to their environment. So everything to do with human inwardness and personal and social behaviour remained the province of the preacher and the moralist. And then the prophet, to take this on one further, was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who at the beginning of the 19th century put forward his idea of evolution as a theological idea, of a striving towards perfection, of going nearer and nearer to heaven. Lamarck was not taken very seriously anywhere outside France. He was a Frenchman, actually. But at the same time, other things were happening. The earth was getting older. Fossils were being recognized as the remains of animals that had lived. The classical dating of the earth at something like 6,000 years was being stretched out. Isaac Newton calculated the earth was 50,000 years old, but he thought he must have got something wrong because the Bible didn't say it. Count Buffon worked out it was 75,000 years. And he suggested that there had been epochs of Earth history. In 1785, James Hutton declared that the Earth had no vestige of a beginning. And all this raised questions about the animals and plants which are represented by fossils. Ernst Mayr has described the time factor in the history of life on Earth as the Achilles heel of natural theology. A creator could be presumed to create a perfect organism for its environment in an unchanging world, but this perfect adaptation would disappear if the environment changed. Adaptation to changes in climate, to the physical structure of the Earth's surface, and to predators and competitors is only possible if organisms can adjust to their circumstances. In other words, if they evolve. And then the other thing that was beginning to be questioned was the nature of animals. William Buckland, who was reader, effectively I think first professor of geology in Oxford, is that right? Buckland? He distinguished between biological death and human death. He argued there's no foundation in the Bible for the belief that carnivorous animals did not exist in paradise. He was criticized for this and preached a university sermon on Romans 5:12. By one man sin came into the world. He argued, in fact, that God ordained biological death. God gave the plants to the animals to eat. And plant death, of course, is much biological death as animal death. The death that entered the world in the story of Adam and Eve was separation from God. And the life in the Christian tradition that comes through Christ is a reconnection with God. It's not physical death. You were dead, but now you're alive. All this, philosophically and theologically, was overlain by the ethos of Archdeacon Paley's idea of a great watchmaker or a divine mechanic. his works were required reading here in Cambridge until the beginning of the 20th century. And Darwin, in fact, regarded Paley's books as almost the most worthwhile things he was made to read when he was a student at this university. And just for the record, I did not at that time trouble myself with Paley's premises, not Euclid's. That's my typing. Interesting, Paley plagiarized John Ray a century before him, who'd written on the wisdom of God manifested in the works of creation. Ray had argued that creation led us to the worship of God. Paley took virtually, and certainly without acknowledging them, Ray's examples and said, here is examples of design. By the time that Darwin came to write The Origin, which of course was published in 1859, there were all sorts of ideas floating around. There's Paley and his great mechanic, a deism. Robert Chambers, whose Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation had been a bestseller, in fact sold more copies than The Origin of Species, and introduced evolution to the chattering classes. He wrote that when there is a choice between special creation and the operation of general laws instituted by the Creator, I would say that the latter, general laws instituted by the Creator, is greatly preferable, as it implies a far grander view of the divine power and dignity than the other. Darwin regarded Chambers' prose as perfect, but the geology struck him as bad and the zoology far worse. But he welcomed Chambers' work because it did excellent service in calling in this country attention to the subject of evolution and in removing prejudices. And the reaction, and probably not very marked reaction, or not very widespread, was from Philip Goss, who was one of the early Plymouth Brethren, very conservative sort of Christians, who wrote a book called Omphalos. And you will know from your Greek what an omphalos is. It's your tummy button. And the question was, did Adam have an omphalos? Because if he'd been born in the normal way from a mother, he must have had one. But if he was created specially by God, he didn't. It took him 376 pages to decide that Adam, in fact, did have an omphalos, that the original creation had been created by God as if it was old. So if you cut down a tree in the Garden of Eden, beginning of November, I mean the creation was in end of October, if you cut it down in November, the tree would have had the rings as if it was an old tree. I mean, it suggests that God was actually trying to cheat. But here was a reaction against evolutionary ideas. But the idea of law was coming to biology. Darwin himself spoke about the variety in nature. He described it as a tangled bank. And look at it, he said, and it's all been produced by laws acting around us. And he set out these laws: growth with reproduction, inheritance, variability, a ratio of increase, Malthus. And the same page that he quotes Francis Bacon, he quotes William Whewell, Master of Trinity College in this university. With regard to the natural world, we can at least go as far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power, not, if you like, by special activity exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws. One of Darwin's critics was the Duke of Argyll, who was a serious politician as well as a critic of Darwin. And he wrote a book which was all about law, creation by law, evolution by law, development by law. The reign of law is nothing but the reign of creative force directed by creative knowledge. The acceptance of Darwinian ideas in this country is generally regarded as being complete by the mid-1880s and is marked by a series of lectures by Frederick Temple. The relationships between religion and science. And obviously he wasn't considered too much of a heretic, because 3 or 4 years later they made him Archbishop of Canterbury. And in this book, in the relations between religion and science, Temple wrote, God did not make things, we may say, no, but he made them make themselves. We look on the Almighty as creating the original elements of matter, never mind art, determining their number and properties, creating the law of gravitation, whereby it seems probable the worlds have been formed, creating the various laws of chemical and physical action by which inorganic substances have been combined, creating above all the laws of life, the mysterious law which plainly contains such wonderful possibilities within itself, and thus providing for the ultimate development of all the many wonders of nature. And on a more theological note, Aubrey Moore, an Oxford theologian, wrote in an essay on the nature of God, often quoted words, "The break-up of the medieval system of thought and life resulted in an atomism," you say that, in an atomism, which, if it had been more perfectly consistent with itself, would have been fatal alike to knowledge and society. Its theory of knowledge was a crude empiricism, its theology unrelieved deism. This is Paley, of course. God was throned in magnificent inactivity in a remote corner of the universe. A machinery of secondary causes had practically taken his place. Slowly but surely, that theory of the world has been undermined. The one absolutely impossible conception of God in the present day is that which represents him as an occasional visitor. Science had pushed the deist God farther and farther away. And at the moment when it seems as if God would be pushed out altogether, Darwinism appeared, and under the disguise of a foe did the work of a friend. Often quoted words. Well, that's my background. What about the actual relationship of God to this world? What about nature read in tooth and claw? And I'm going to say virtually nothing about this because this is tomorrow's subject. Richard Swinburne is going to talk about this in detail. But it might be worth just recalling, because somebody's mentioned Francis Collins' new book, that Francis Collins, as a young pediatric doctor dealing with sick children, realizing that the problems they were suffering were genetic problems, this is what brought him into genetics. It was a response to, if you like, nature read in tooth and claw that put him on his track. Darwin, of course, saw this as a problem, and he didn't know the answer. He wrote to his friend Asa Gray in Harvard, the chief protagonist of Darwin's ideas in the States. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent God would have designedly created the ignominy, the parasitic insects, with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. I cannot be contented to view this wonderful universe, and especially the nature of man, and to conclude that everything is the result of brute force. Lightning kills a man if he hasn't got a good lightning conductor. and it doesn't matter whether he's a good one or a bad one, owing to the excessively complex action of natural laws. The more I think about it, the more bewildered I become. So, God and creation. And rather arbitrarily and artificially, I've divided this under 4 headings. We can envisage God as indolent, not bothering to look after his creatures. Complete fatalism. Life is ruled by capricious acts, not loving care. Inshallah, or karma. Probably more characteristic of pre-scientific times, or those living in non-scientific situations. We get a very nice example in the Old Testament of Elijah mocking the priests of Baal because God didn't seem to be answering their prayers. He said, "Call louder." He's a god. Maybe he's deep in thought, or engaged, or on a journey. Or he may have gone to sleep and must be woken up. That's one way of looking at the relationship. I don't think it's a very helpful one, and I doubt if anybody here has the idea that God is really not bothering with his creation. He might be incompetent. You know, he was such a lousy designer that bad things happen. David Hull has written, "Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural history may be like, he is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He's also not a loving God who cares about his productions. He is not even the awful God portrayed in the book of Job. The God of the Galapagos, as indicating examples of evolution, is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray." And David Hull wrote that in a review in Nature of Philip Johnson's Darwin on Trial. Now, Hull is polemicizing. Horror is a human reaction. Pain is a necessary mechanism for survival. Death is a thermodynamic necessity. Waste implies purposelessness. But he does raise valid questions. And they're questions about the nature of God which have often received inadequate answers, ranging from the extreme anthropocentricity of Aquinas and Paley, that all must be best for humankind, through claims that non-human suffering is somehow redemptive, to suggestions of what has been called a pan-experiential metaphysicism, as imagined by Teilhard de Chardin and Rupert Sheldrake. And Rupert Sheldrake finds common ground with Matthew Fox and his creation spirituality. And I put incidentally into this category John Hort, who has written quite widely on evolutionary topics from his own perspective. He's a Roman Catholic in recent years. Chris Southgate, who is a poet and a theologian in Exeter, has argued that God does not abandon the victims of evolution because we have a calling stemming from Christ's transforming power on the cross to participate in the healing of the world. And I think that needs a bit of unpacking, working out. It relates perhaps to Paul's statement in Colossians that Christ reconciled all things on earth and heaven to himself through his blood on the cross. But I'm not going to develop that at this point. Perhaps the commonest understanding of God's reaction, involvement in the world, is that he's impotent. People believe there is a God, but that God can't actually change things, can't actually do anything. It's not relevant in their own lives. one can break down this under different headings. Naturalism, and I'm speaking of naturalism as a philosophical idea rather than a biological idea. God declared creation to be very good. The fossil record is full of extinct forms, completely before human activity, nothing to do with human activities. Biologists interpret such extinctions as the natural consequences of the evolutionary process. Critics, of whom the most vocal recent ones are Ernin's colleague Alvin Plattinger and Philip Johnson, regard this understanding as naturalism because it explicitly excludes any personal or active God. Often linked to this is the claim that biological or Darwinian evolution is dependent on chance, because the origin of all variation is seen as random mutation. Jacques Monod's Chance and Necessity has already been mentioned today. Monod argued that the world was based completely on chance because it was based on mutation. And mutation are chance events. Now, there are two answers to this. One's a scientific answer. It's not genes that are selected, whatever Richard Dawkins may say, it is phenotypes. And the variation underlying phenotypic variation on which selection acts, only a very small part, perhaps less than 5%, is due to new mutation. And also, of course, phenotypes are determined by many genes acting together, whether it's 275 or 350 or whatever. So it is chance at the selective level doesn't exist. Selection is adaptation, adaptation to the environment. Theologically also, if one believes and accepts that God is sovereign in the most predictable and law-abiding actions, he is in charge. Naturalism is a philosophical approach. I mean, Philip Johnson calls it a metaphysical doctrine. It is, which simply states that a particular view of what is ultimately real and unreal, and it's described, it's defined restrictively. Are not two sparrows sold for a penny, yet without your Father's knowledge not one of them can fall to the ground? To assume that natural causes are in operation no way disproves or excludes God. And again, to go back to the crossing of the Red Sea, we can dream up very likely mechanisms for the way that the waters parted. The crunch of that miracle was that it happened just at the right time. The waters parted so that the Israelites could cross safely, and then they unparted to swallow up all the baddies who were chasing them. I bet they're praying that at the moment. So, naturalism, process theology or panentheism, and what I'm saying here is very inadequate because it's a fashionable movement in many theological circles. It's based on the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, developed in the theology of John Cobb, and as a scientist, Charles Birch, who was Professor of Zoology in Adelaide in Australia. The idea is that we have no grounds for belief in any other form of reality than what we experience. God is seen as developing, God himself is developing in and through the world, and being influenced and changed by it. He is described as being bipolar, with primordial traits, but also consequent properties, and unable, therefore, to determine events. Christ's deity and redemptive activity is an enormous problem for the process theologians. But panentheism, the process theology, has been very attractive to many environmental theologians because it seems to involve God in the world. it deviates radically from traditional theism. Michael Northcote wrote a few years ago, "An immanent suffering God is also by definition a God who is the progenitor of evil and suffering. A God who is totally identified with all life is a God who commits a tremendous amount of evil, including not only natural evils like parasitism, but also human evils like genocide, vivisection, and species extinction." Another fashionable idea is kenosis, based on the idea, the statement that Paul makes in Philippians, that Christ emptied himself and therefore was unable to routinely affect events in the world. I'd be quite interested on John Polkinghorne's ideas on this, because he's been involved in discussions around the whole idea of kenosis. To me, it doesn't help at all. It implies that God has opted out of the traditional understanding that creation and the continual control of the world, what we certainly used to call providence, these merge into each other in biblical thought. In all the Abrahamic religions, God is the provider as well as the creator. In Christianity, Jesus and God's spirits are the agents of this. I think it was Stuart Judge who quoted Colossians, "All things hold together in him. He, the Son, sustains the universe by his word of power." Tom Wright, who is an Episcopalian in this country, which doesn't have the overtones as in other parts of the world, has written, "Paul says that Jesus emptied himself. People have sometimes thought that this means that Jesus, having been divine up to that point, somehow stopped being divine when he became human, and then went back to being divine again. This is, in fact, completely untrue to what Paul has in mind. The point is that Jesus was indeed already equal with God, and somehow Paul is saying that Jesus already existed even before he became a human being, but the decision to become human and to go all the way along the road of obedience to the divine plan of salvation, all the way to the cross, this decision was not a decision to stop being divine. It was a decision about what it really meant to be divine. The eternal Son of God, the one who became human, in and as Jesus of Nazareth, regarded his equality with God as committed himself to the course he took." Well, certainly panentheism and kenosis are the most fashionable theological ideas around at the moment. There is also the possibility, of course, that God doesn't exist. And this is Richard Dawkins' God. I don't think it's worth saying anything about that. Because by definition, if we talk about God's action, if God isn't there, he doesn't act. So let's go on to God interfering. And historically, this has been perhaps the most common way God has been seen to be operating in nature, tweaking systems to produce his will. Way back in the early days of understanding evolution, it's been suggested that God somehow controlled mutation, producing the right God of the gaps. This, in recent years, has become the notion that God acts through quantum processes at the molecular level to control things. Now, to me, this is just a sophisticated argument of God of the gaps. We don't know what's happening, therefore, perhaps God. The intelligent design movement is also part of the interfering God, because if you're having intelligent design, it means that characters which Michael Behe incorrectly, in fact, labels. And if you want a good discussion of it, read chapter 7 of The Origin of Species. shows how God makes no distinction between creation and providence. To distinguish between the two takes us right back to Paley and Aubrey Moore. So, having got rid of so what, or what? How do I put this together? And I will join hands very much with Stuart Judge and Donald Mackay. Donald Mackay was very definite that there is enormous danger in separating different causes of events. He called it the fallacy of nothing buttery. Water boils when the molecules rush around. Well, yes, that's true. But if you say it's only that, you don't also have the explanation that you actually put the kettle onto the gas to heat up the water. There are two explanations. Peter Medawar, in his last book, apart from his autobiography, wrote that there is indeed, that there is a limit upon science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, that no conceivable advances of science would enable it to answer. These are the questions children ask, the ultimate questions of Karl Popper. I have in mind such questions as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? These questions make sense to those who ask them, and the answers to those who give them. But whatever else is in dispute, it will be universally agreed that it is not to science that we should look for answers. There is then a prima facie case for the existence of a limit to scientific understanding. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that there's a limit to science, to saying that science may be saying two things about the same situation. And this is the well-known situation that Niels Bohr faced with the nature of light, particulate or wave theory. And he said you've got to take both these explanations seriously. And he said let's call them complementary. And quoting Bohr, the phenomena transcend the scope of classical physical explanation, but must be regarded as complementary in the sense that only the totality of the phenomena exhausts the possible information about the objects. And he thought this could be a wider implications. As he said, in biological research, references to features of wholeness and purposeful reactions or organisms are used together with increasingly detailed information on structure and regulatory processes. It must be realized that the attitudes termed mechanistic and finalistic are not contradictory points of view, but rather exhibit a complementary relationship which is connected with our positions as observers of nature. Now, a whole lot of other people have seized on this. Robert Oppenheimer, Charles Coulson. Theological implications really have been developed most extensively by Donald Mackay, both as a static notion. I mean, he pictured, for example, a painter, and you can describe the picture that the painter made as a two-dimensional distribution of molecules, or as something that was in the mind of the painter. You talk about the same physical object, but it has two completely overlapping but non-contradictory explanations. And Mackay extended this to a dynamic idea. He said, look at a television program, look at a game of football, and you can see what is going on. You can work out the rules of the games of football. But you can also explain what you're seeing in terms of I don't know how these things work nowadays, electronics, electrophysiology, and so on. Two completely different explanations. And Donald summarizes all this. The God in whom the Bible invites belief is no cosmic mechanic. Rather, he is the cosmic artist, the creative upholder, without whose continual activity there will be not even chaos, but just nothing. What we call physical laws are expressions of the regularity we find in the pattern of created events that we study in the physical world. Theologically, they express the stability of the great artist's creative will. Explanations in terms of scientific laws are thus not rival answers to the same question, yet they are not talking about different things. They are, or anyway, purport to be, complementary accounts of different aspects of the same happening, which in its full nature cannot be adequately described by either alone. God's activity in creation does not depend upon an interfering deity, nor are the facts consistent with an indolent or impotent deity. Rather, we can, and perhaps should, envisage God as both transcendent and immanent, both up there and out there and inside and working. Belief in him is truly theistically, as distinct from the Unitarian deism of creationism or the panentheism of the philosophers or New Age. Psalm 8 expresses this very well. The writer puts the magnificence of the creation alongside the fact that God cares for us human beings. I've got a section on humans, which I will omit and close with a quotation from J.B.S. Haldane, who's already been mentioned, who was chairman of my department when I began my PhD. Haldane wrote, "My suspicion is that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. I have read and heard many attempts at a systematic account of it, from materialism and theosophy to the Christian system or that of Kant. I've always felt that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of or can be dreamt of by any philosophy." And Michael Roos concluded his book, Can a Darwinian be a Christian? Being a Darwinian does not compel one to be a Christian, but because one is a Darwinian, one is opening the way for someone to be a Christian. And I'll stop there. Just in time to have a drink before dinner.
Oh, no. Not getting away that easily. So thanks very much, Sam. So we will have some questions, and but we'll also have time for questions later on the panel this evening. So let's have some immediate questions now. Yeah, microphone. Yeah, microphone. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. You referred to the term inshallah for a kind of an indolent understanding of God. I really couldn't make a sense of that. And how do you infer that?
I may be completely misunderstanding the use of it. I hear Muslims make a statement that's inshallah, if God wills, without any thought of what God might or might not will. It is just, he's going to do it anyway, It's pure fatalism. Now, am I unfair?
Well, I use the term inshallah.
Yeah, quite.
As a Muslim, being myself. And what we mean is that you can never know the future. And there's a verse in the Quran. The Quran says, never say, I will do this definitely tomorrow.
Yeah.
Always say, I will do this if God wills it.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of it's an allusion to God's majesty. And we can never be sure about something. So we just, show a respect by saying if God
I would say
wills.
that's the proper use of inshallah.
Okay.
But would you accept that people just say, inshallah, I can't do anything about it? So,
Yeah, there's a pejorative use
Yeah,
of inshallah,
okay.
which doesn't really make sense to me.
Okay,
either,
well, I'm
but-
using with a little p around it.
Okay, but there's a good inshallah.
Yeah, okay, right.
Inshallah, we'll use that.
Yeah, right.
We have the same in Christian.
Deo Valente.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah.
Thank you.
We've got a question in the front.
My apologies for...
I think there are kind of similar
Hold
concern
the mic a bit closer to your mouth.
about karma. Karma is not about fate or destiny or fatalism, okay? And there has been a kind of misinterpretation of the doctrine of karma, that karma is kind of a blind force. It's not like that. It's kind of actually rather exertion or application of free will to organize our lives in the present and making the way for the future or the destiny. And in a way, it could be said that we are the maker of our own destiny. And it's not just, we are creating our own fate. And God, of course, can change the course of karma. And there have been many, literature on that point.
Thank you. Thank you. Should I leave now? It might be safer.
Please.
Good. Another question. Oh, sorry, around back. Yes, Maria.
Afraid there might be another one on a similar vein, actually. But I find it extremely helpful, actually, the way you set things out and put different theological views. I'm aware with kenosis that it is often used as God being impotent and as God as being a victim of his own creation, and I think that's an entirely wrong way. I do think that it is obviously in Philippians, it's a biblical word, that we can develop it as a biblical doctrine. In terms, I recently read a PhD thesis that used it in terms of displacement, somebody coming out of a mission experience of being a refugee, and seeing in that the displacement you see in exile in the Old Testament, and of God actually being willing in Jesus to be entirely, completely divine, but in becoming entirely, completely part of his creation. In some way engaging with that experience that has been the experience of the people of God. And so it can be developed as a biblical doctrine, but it also can be taken off in entirely non-biblical and I would say heretical directions. But it was very helpful to see the dangers of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I mean, another way, same sorts of ideas are talked about, of God taking a risk with us. Well, yes, he does take a risk with us, but again, there's our part in, I won't say taking a risk with God, but in responding to God responsibly. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question right over the side here.
Professor, I wasn't quite clear about why you didn't allow the distinction between creation and providence, because in the general understanding of providence, at least, it's the kind of favourable circumstance of the environment towards me as an individual.
I would just say that the Bible doesn't make that distinction. I mean, I can't speak for the other great books. God is in control of this world. In the beginning, God upholds all things. You can make a sort of pigeonhole God at different stages, but that's not there in the Bible.
Well, you sort of get the instances, for example, of Elijah being told that the widow, the jar of meal is not going to run out, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which is obviously not creation. I mean, it's
No, it's God in control of all things, at all times.
But I'm sort of wondering about that you don't allow the distinction between creation and providence.
No. What I'm talking about is God in action in the world. God was there at the beginning, or rather before the beginning, and he's still there and still doing things. He didn't stop on, what was it, the 24th of October, 4004 BC, when he said, everything's finished. He didn't stop. He upholds things ever since. It's the same God, the same work. That's the distinction I'm making. It's an important distinction. And I'm sure the editor of Sounds of Christian Belief would give you a copy of his most recent volume. There's a very good article in it by Oliver Berkeley, exactly on this point. So ask him nicely.
Okay, good. I think we'll come back to the front row here again. And
This is regarding process theology or pantheism, which you have mentioned. If you kindly let me into the house of Christianity, then I can, dare comment on Hindu interpretation about what is there in the Bible. If I am not wrong, in John it is there that nothing was made without him. When it is translated into our language, it resonates very well with the notion that in everything what was made, he or his prints or design was there. So if nothing is made without him, it could be interpreted as that he is there in everything what was made.
Yes.
And in a way it leads to pantheism. I am saying because some Hindus do believe that it could be interpreted that way, and pantheism is not something out of relation with the Bible, rather element which is there in the Bible.
But
Would you please comment on that?
well, I would comment that God is the designer of you and me, if you like. But he is not, I'm not God, you're not God. To say that we are God, that is pantheism. To say that God designed us and cares for us, looks after us, is certainly traditional Christianity, and I suspect it's traditional of most of the great religions. It's worshipping the thing rather than the God. That's pantheism.
Thanks.
And panentheism is different. Panentheism is the argument that God is changed by what he's doing. So there's no immutable absoluteness about God. And that's the danger of it, as I see it. But it has many adherents.
Thanks.
okay, Ernan, just along the road here. Yes, thank you.
I'm a little nervous about your way of starting science in 1543. Things did happen before 1543.
True.
You take Copernicus's astronomy here, represents the importance of accurate observation. Those observations had been made by the Babylonians,
Right.
by the Greeks. And in fact, quite a number of the observations Copernicus used were Babylonian observations. And above all, of Ptolemy. I mean, the notion that accurate observation began with Copernicus, or even in that century, or even in the and then this wonderful passage from Trevelyan is a masterpiece of overstatement. It's wonderful. It's the kind of thing that you might hear from a Shakespearean stage,
Right.
but not from a real scholar. The idea that the idea of regular law guiding the universe was unfamiliar to the contemporaries of Francis Bacon. Which contemporaries? The people who are following the fairies in the fields?
Yes.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, well,
But those
that's what I'm
aren't
talking
the
about.
only contemporaries.
No,
you
no.
know.
But I mean, just to come back to your point about there being accurate observation between 1543, we're right back on Art's point that these did not become part of the fabric of the understanding. And so I'd stand by 1543, give or take 100 years.
Well, yeah, you're talking of the popular understanding. If that's what you mean, then you're right. But that's really a rather partial way of looking at it.
A bit more than popular, I think. I mean, it was...
Look, think of, I mean, for heaven's sake, think of the philosophy of Aristotle.
Yeah.
I mean, Aristotle was a great observation.
Right,
His
right.
biology was
Very good.
one example.
Very good.
So, I mean, the Aristotelian scholars, the neo-Aristotelian scholars of the late scholastic period, where one could fault them on many grounds, but not really so easily on the grounds that you're mentioning here. They are aware of the importance of observation. I mean, they're using Aristotle's observations much too slavishly.
I think that's really what I'm saying. I mean, just again to quote from my younger years in the university, I was taught by Charles Raven, who had just stopped being Regius Professor of Divinity. I think he's probably a better botanist than a theologian, actually. But he argued that in late medieval times, biology had become very stylized and artificial in terms of bestiaries and herbals. If you wanted to look at what the understanding of the common man was, go and look at the carvings in some of the cathedrals at that time. We had very accurate, you can identify the carvings down to species level at the time, which was so different to the scholastic understanding. So it really depends what you mean by common understanding, who understood it, and so on.
I think it was, you know, if you take that period, it's a very complex period. And I think the whole notion of understanding at different levels, people working, for example, in the artisan trades, say dyeing, not the chemical trades as we would call them today, were of course relying on observation heavily. But if you take a field like optics, for example, was developing very much long before this. The development of lenses, and in particular, you know, fields like, obviously, like astronomy. I mean, there was a lot of very good astronomy going on long before Copernicus. It's just I'm uneasy at this idea, you know, the revolution starts and nothing had happened before that. I mean, that's...
I would agree with you entirely. Obviously, I would agree.
Okay, I think what we'll do actually is break now. And first of all, we want to thank Sam very, very much indeed for a great talk.